continuing tonight to talk about the difficulties associated with leasehold properties. 08085 909 693. Leaseholders have spoken to the BBC about the impact on their mental health and their pocket because of the sharp rise in fees and service charges they've faced, and of their fight to hold the freeholder to account. Suzanne Muna is co-founder of the Social Housing Action Campaign. It aims to help people's housing conditions. Hello, Suzanne.
Hello there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what are your thoughts, Suzanne, on the BBC investigation and what we're hearing tonight?
I mean, we've been all throughout the day, haven't we? We've been hearing case studies on this, and absolutely heartbreaking to hear the stress that has been caused people, and this idea that they are trapped, that they haven't got any control over what's happening, but they are somehow still liable to pay these huge sums of money. And what we can say from SHAC is that we know that this is absolutely endemic. It's right across the country. It affects leaseholders, it affects shared owners, who are another form of leasehold where they part rent, and it also affects full renters. So it's something that's absolutely crying out for regulation, and it's an area where there is absolutely no regulation at the moment. There is legislation in place that says you should only be the Landlord and Tenant Act, which, freeholder is a type of landlord, and the legislation says that they should only charge, they should be legitimate charges, should be genuinely incurred and reasonable. But it's very, very hard. So even though that legislation is in place and there are other bits of legislation in place to protect people, it's very, very hard to enforce them. And I think Tara hinted at that, didn't she, about the difficulties of actually enforcing your rights. So as well as what we would call service charge abuse, we see it as a form of financial abuse. There's also then this huge problem around enforcement as well. I would say to people, I mean, the stories are very, very frightening, aren't they, to people? But I would say there is help out there. I mean, SHAC doesn't do casework, but we can help give people advice on how to organise and work with other people and sort of organise as tenants. But there are other groups out there as well. So I just wouldn't want people going away feeling like they are completely alone on this. There are certainly lots of other people and sources of advice and help. But we would like to see some really big changes to the legislation here.
Well, as part of her investigation, Tara Wells spoke to Jaslyn Mangaroo from the Property Institute. They represent managing agents. Here's what she had to say.
The stock that we have after that sort of big building boom, these buildings are getting older and they're becoming more expensive to maintain and repair and look after. And that's only going to be a problem that keeps getting worse. As a building gets to 40, 50, 60 years old, those repair costs are going to increase.
Well, that's the other side of this, of course, Suzanne, isn't it? Or at least the other side of the argument, where these property owners are saying, do you know what? It's really expensive to keep and maintain a building.
Yeah, but, they knew that when they bought the buildings. I mean, they bought the buildings, they've made huge profits out of them, or surpluses for housing associations who are significant freeholders in this country. People tend to think of housing associations as just renting out properties at submarket, but they actually have a huge portfolio of freeholders to a huge number of properties as well for shared owners and leaseholders, and their surpluses are 4.4 billion at the moment. They've certainly got the money to make the repairs. They've certainly got the money to make sure that people's bills aren't massive, and they also have the buying power to buy in bulk, to buy services in bulk, and should actually be a lot cheaper than you and I might pay to have our windows cleaned or to have new carpet laid or something like that. We hear all the time, don't we, that these bigger organisations can offer efficiencies of scale, but when we compare the cost of the kind of standard communal services and the supply of things like water and electricity, it's much more expensive than your average domestic user, ordinary domestic user. So something is going on somewhere, and people are making a lot of money out of this, and they're making it out of people who really have no levers that they can pull to actually challenge this.
I guess a lot of these people can't afford to go to
Yeah.
tribunal, go to court, and be
Yeah.
frightened with the cost of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, landlords will often threaten that if they lose, they will ask the courts to award legal costs, so that the tenant or resident that's in court has to pay the legal costs. And even though the courts very rarely actually grant that, it's obviously going to be a massive threat, isn't it? That's going to put you off a lot when you're thinking that's going to be part of your calculation. They also turn up with a barrister, with a room full of solicitors, with their full-time legal staff, so they're racking up the costs, whereas on the other hand, on the other side of the court, the tenant or resident is sat on their own, because they can't afford, there's no legal aid, they can't afford to cover the costs, they can't, it's very difficult to find someone to represent you for free. We think that actually the courts could play a different role, which is that in Spain, you can, if you dispute your service charges, you can actually pay them to the court. So you can't just use a dispute as a way of getting out of paying your charge. You still pay it, but you pay it to the court. And then the onus is on the landlord to actually prove that those charges are legitimate, they're not extortionate, they're not fraudulent, that they are genuinely incurred costs and, incurred at a reasonable level. And only then would the landlord actually get the money. So we see that as quite a good way of actually balancing the interests of both sides. And we would like to see a similar system brought in here in Britain, because clearly we cannot go on with people being priced out of their homes, and guess what? The equity then goes to the freeholder.
Suzanne, thank you. Really helpful tonight.